This is wrestling's greatest moments.
Hey now, wrestling fans. It's time for another episode of Wrestling's Greatest Moments. Whether you call them stables, factions, or families, groups of wrestlers, usually heels, but not always, have been an important part of wrestling. Sit back, as Wrestling's Greatest Moments looks at 8 80s wrestling factions. Before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single video. Criteria. Just what is a faction? Wrestling's Greatest Moments defines a faction as any group of 3 or more wrestlers, not counting a manager. Pro wrestling has had many factions, not only in the 1980s, but we'll focus on the 80s factions for now. Don't worry if your favorite faction isn't listed, as more videos are on the way. Anderson's Army. Double Tough wrestler Gene Anderson pounded out a name for himself while he worked stiff matches as part of the Minnesota Wrecking Crew. The faction began in the late 1960s with Gene and kayfabe brother Lars and expanded with the addition of not-so-little baby brother Ole. The Andersons were a dominant force in Georgia Championship Wrestling and Jim Crockett Promotions, aka Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, winning one tag team title after another. In 1979, Gene Anderson began managing in Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling after Nature Boy Buddy Rogers was written off with a kayfabe injury from Ric Flair. Rogers had been managing several heels in Mid-Atlantic, including Jimmy Superfly Snuka, Big John Studd, and Ken Patera. Anderson took over Rogers' stable and added to it, bringing in the Iron Sheik and Ray the Crippler Stevens. Patera left the area, while Studd lost a Loser Leaves Town match to Blackjack Mulligan and came back as the Masked Superstar number 2. With Gene guiding them, Anderson's Army found success, winning several of the area's titles. At one point, Snuka held the United States Championship and later teamed with Stevens to win the NWA World Tag Team Championship. The Iron Sheik would win the Mid-Atlantic Heavyweight Championship, feuding with Blackjack Mulligan and Jumping Jim Brunzell. Anderson's Army later added wrestlers the Masked Superstar, Ivan Koloff, Ninja, and Gene's storyline brother Ole. Anderson's Army proved to be the perfect foil for Mid-Atlantic's babyfaces, and the faction was involved in several big storylines. Let's look at 2. The first saw Greg the Hammer Valentine reunite with former friend and tag team partner Ric Flair. Flair had turned babyface, but Valentine was still working as a heel. Valentine begged Flair to team up again, proclaiming he'd seen the light. Flair eventually gave in and teamed with Valentine against Anderson's team of Jimmy Snuka and the Iron Sheik. The match became a nightmare for Flair as he was busted open by the heels and struggled to make the tag. However, Valentine refused to tag in, turning the match into a 2-on-1 beating. Afterward, Valentine took Gene Anderson's cane and was supposed to break it over Flair's head. The cane refused to budge, and as Valentine told Mid-Atlantic Gateway in a 2004 interview, "Rick knew I was supposed to break the cane, but later I found out that the cane was made of hickory wood. You know, the hardest wood there is. They make baseball bats out of hickory." The Hammer lived up to his nickname, pounding Flair with the cane, but it refused to break. According to Valentine, he accidentally struck Flair in the nose, breaking his nose. Greg later called Flair to apologize when he found out what had happened, but Flair blew it off, telling his on-screen rival that the angle would make them a lot of money. The angle fueled the Valentine-Flair feud, but it also led to tag team matches in which Flair teamed up with other babyfaces to take on Valentine and Anderson's Army. Another big angle involved Mid-Atlantic babyface Blackjack Mulligan and Gene's client, the Iron Sheik. Mulligan, who was the wrestling equivalent of John Wayne as a babyface, and just as popular, didn't take kindly to the Iron Sheik's anti-American ways. When the Iron Sheik challenged Mulligan to master his Persian clubs, Mulligan agreed, no doubt tempted by the cash reward that came with it. Mulligan initially struggled, but seemed to gain control, leading to an attack by the Iron Sheik, where he whipped Mulligan. This led to some wild matches between Blackjack and the Iron Sheik. While Gene was a strong silent type, he could cut a good enough promo to help get his clients over. More importantly, he was a manager who posed a legitimate threat to anyone who stumbled his way, especially with Anderson wielding a cane. The faction continued until 1981, when Gene reunited with Ole Anderson, winning the NWA World Tag Team Championship. The Four Horsemen. Wrestling had factions long before the Four Horsemen, and wrestling have had factions long after. However, the Four Horsemen created a rich legacy, no matter how often the concept was recycled. The Four Horsemen were the wrestling equivalent of musical supergroups like Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, The Highwaymen, and Audioslave. Nature Boy Ric Flair, a multiple-time world champion who had already established his legacy. Ole Anderson, part of the legendary Minnesota Wrecking Crew, and who continued it with his nephew Arn, or cousin, depending on the story at the time. Tully Blanchard, a rising star firmly entrenched as one of Mid-Atlantic's top singles heels. The Four Horsemen were the natural offshoot of the Minnesota Wrecking Crew, a faction briefly discussed in our look at Anderson's army. As mentioned in our series, Ric Flair, the Mid-Atlantic Years, Ric Flair was introduced as the Andersons' cousin, teaming with, then feuding with Gene and Ole. Gene Anderson retired after suffering an injury, but the Anderson name continued when Arn Anderson came to Georgia Championship Wrestling, eventually teaming with Ole. The timing couldn't have been better, as the Minnesota Wrecking Crew backed Ric Flair during his many wars against the American Dream Dusty Rhodes. Remarkably, the Four Horsemen came about organically. As historian Tim Hornbaker explains, there was a growing bond between Flair, U.S. champion Blanchard, and the Andersons, who held the National Tag Team Championship. And although it wasn't by design, a new powerful stable of villains materialized. The chemistry between the Four Horsemen was instant, and during interviews, they delivered articulate and commanding performances, while complimenting each other in the ring. The story of how the group got its name demonstrated its natural development. Flair, Blanchard, and the Andersons were cutting a promo when Arn Anderson remarked, "The only time this much havoc has been wreaked by this few people, you'd have to go back to the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse." As Arn recalls, "I put no thought into it beforehand, it just popped into my head. I was trying to think about all the negative things we represented and all the horror we were going to rain on the world. It was an interview line for one individual day that grew into a gimmick." In his book, The Four Horsemen, A Timeline History, wrestling historian Dick Bourne explains what made the Horsemen different from other factions or stables. The four men who came together to form the original group, Ole and Arn Anderson, Ric Flair, and Tully Blanchard, were simply four wrestlers who had common goals, common lifestyles, and common enemies. The commonality was easy to explain. All four men liked to win and retain championship gold. They enjoyed the luxurious lifestyle that came with being champions. Their alliance gave them strength in numbers because anyone who crossed one horseman had to deal with all four. While Dusty Rhodes was a common enemy, the Horsemen's hit list would grow over time to include some of JCP's top babyfaces, including the Rock and Roll Express, Magnum TA, the Road Warriors, and Ronnie Garvin. According to Ric Flair, the Horsemen were a tight-knit group behind the scenes. There was no jealousy in the Four Horsemen. Everybody liked the idea and ran with it. We could all talk. We could all wrestle. Every night, we made our foes, selling whatever they could throw our way. And JJ was an experienced wrestler who could get in the ring and perform. The group will never be duplicated. The original Horsemen lived their on-screen lifestyle of wealthy playboys off-screen, except for founding horseman Ole Anderson, who avoided the all-night partying. According to journalist and historian Mike Muniam, Ole was most proud of his tag team with Gene Anderson. And while Anderson was best known for his 1985-87 run as one of the original Four Horsemen, he would typically downplay that period of his career, preferring to talk about the time he spent with Gene as one of the greatest tag teams in pro wrestling history during the 60s and 70s. Nevertheless, Ole played his part well as the group's anchor, until a disagreement with the group led to him leaving, with associate member Lex Luger replacing him. Despite being heels, the Four Horsemen were always entertaining, particularly during their promos. Fans tuning into World Championship Wrestling on the Superstation saw many squash matches, but it was worth waiting for one or more members of the Horsemen to cut promos. On occasion, fans got to see run-ins between the Horsemen and Jim Crockett Promotions' many babyfaces. These run-ins would lead to big-money programs, often revolving around Dusty Rhodes' seemingly endless quest for Ric Flair's NWA World Heavyweight Championship. Inevitably, the Horsemen would injure Dusty. While Dusty's rivalry with Ric Flair dates back before the Horsemen, he considers his programs against the faction as the high point of his history with Flair. There were some hot angles I did with Flair, but most of the really hot stuff was with all the Four Horsemen as a whole, like the famous video we shot of them breaking my arm in the Jim Crockett Promotions parking lot in Charlotte. That was pretty brutal for back then. Completely violent, and about as hardcore as you can get. Inevitably, Rhodes struck back at the Horsemen, usually leading to Stardust, teaming with babyfaces Magnum TA, the Rock and Roll Express, and later Nikita Koloff, to even the odds. The Horsemen's propensity for playing the numbers game against opponents also led to the historic War Games match, where the Horsemen and executive director James J. Dillon were locked in a double steel cage against the superpowers, Dusty Rhodes and Nikita Koloff, the Road Warriors, Hawk and Animal, and manager Precious Paul Ellering. While the Horsemen's cheating ways infuriated fans, this led to box office gold for Crockett. In addition, having 4 different wrestlers in the faction created a wide range of potential matchups, whether singles matches, tag team matches, 6-man tag matches, or even 8-man tag matches. The egos involved with the Horsemen always made for exciting angles when a member would leave, or get kicked out of the group, leading to new feuds. This changing structure made for surprises, such as babyface Barry Windham turning on his NWA World Tag Team Champion partner Lex Luger to join the Horsemen. Ironically, not long after Luger had left the Horsemen. Like many entertainment mediums, wrestling is known for taking successful concepts and spinning them off or recycling them ad nauseum. The Horsemen were no exception, especially in the 1990s. However, the 1980s incarnations of the Horsemen were incredible, particularly the original and the third versions. Devastation Incorporated. Whether you call General Skandor Akbar's wrestlers Akbar's Army, or their better-known name, Devastation Incorporated, this collection of heels caused mayhem while also collecting championship gold. Like many a purported foreign heel, Skandor Akbar, aka Jimmy Saeed Weba, didn't let being born in the United States affect his ability to terrorize fans as an international marauder. A 2010 obituary in the Dallas Morning News notes how Skandor got the name he became infamous with. With the help of a Dallas radio announcer, Mr. Weba, whose father was from Lebanon, selected Skandor Akbar, or Alexander the Great. Skandor would have a successful run in the territories, including title reigns in NWA Tri-State, the precursor to Mid-South Wrestling, Georgia Championship Wrestling, and Australia's World Championship Wrestling. Akbar retired from active competition in 1977 before pursuing a career as a manager. Devastation Incorporated would become a familiar name in world-class championship wrestling and Mid-South Wrestling. Akbar always seemed to find the right combination of monster heels to make things dangerous for the area's babyfaces. In Texas, Akbar's Devastation Incorporated included madmen like Kamala, the Missing Link, and the Mongol. Kamala recalls what made Devastation Incorporated stand out. Devastation Incorporated was one of the most scary, bizarre, crazy, and unpredictable of all wrestling factions out there. It always had the most uncontrollable of all characters trying to be controlled by Skandor Akbar. Akbar also understood the need for more balanced minds, as seen by his bringing in the Super Destroyers, aka Scott and Bill Irwin in World Class and Ted DiBiase in Mid-South. General Akbar strongly believed in the concept of strength in numbers, and he wasn't afraid to work with fellow heels such as the Freebirds. However, this backfired in World Class when a miscommunication led to Michael Hayes brawling with his tag team partners from Devastation Incorporated. This led to a fascinating situation where the Freebirds were cheered as they battled Devastation Incorporated, but the Birds were booed when they battled the Von Erichs. Akbar's antics in Mid-South made for many memorable programs. Skandor attained the fans' eternal enmity in the 1970s when he turned on beloved babyface Danny Hodge. Now managing, Akbar campaigned to guide his wrestlers to championship gold and earned the big money that came with titles, a storyline that reminded people why they wanted to win them. Skandor Akbar's antics would lead to many unforgettable programs, including his war with Hacksaw Jim Duggan. Duggan battled Akbar and his faction, which included Duggan's former tag team partner Ted DiBiase, Hercules Hernandez, and what sometimes seemed like a cast of thousands. Skandor nearly put Duggan out of wrestling when he threw a fireball at Duggan, but Hacksaw bounced back, renewing his feud with Akbar and his clients. Like many a manager, Akbar's arrogance got the best of him. When Skandor sought the services of heel Butch Reed, Skandor made the mistake of thinking he could buy Reed. When that failed, Skandor dropped not-so-subtle hints that it would be in Reed's best interest to work with him. Reed attacked Akbar and his faction, forging an unlikely alliance with former rival Jim Duggan to do battle against Skandor and his array of villains. The Varsity Club. After years terrorizing championship wrestling from Florida as the Prince of Darkness, Kevin Sullivan entered WCW with a toned-down version of his popular heel character. While Sullivan ditched the occult elements from his time in Florida, he was still a vicious heel. Sullivan gathered Mike Rotunda and Rick Steiner into his faction, the Varsity Club. The faction's premise was simple but effective. College athletes united by a purpose to use their sports background to drive them to championship gold. Rotunda struck first, defeating Nikita Koloff for the NWA World Television Championship, with some help from Sullivan. Rotunda, who was Florida heavyweight champion before he beat Koloff, gifted Steiner with the belt, giving the group 2 titles. Sullivan called out many of the area's top stars, but his obsession with Jimmy Garvin's valet, Precious, led to a feud between the Varsity Club and Jimmy and Ronnie Garvin. Things got heated, and the Varsity Club quickly learned not to underestimate Precious. On one occasion, Precious clobbered Rick Steiner with a 2x4, then began choking Sullivan with a coat hanger. The Varsity Club's war with the Garvins heated up over the summer, with Steve Dr. Death Williams teaming with Ronnie and Jimmy to even the odds. As the feud progressed, internal strife caused problems as Mike Rotunda and Kevin Sullivan berated Rick Steiner for his sometimes simplistic-like ways. The Varsity Club's Sullivan and Rotunda teamed up with Al Perez, Ivan Koloff, and the Russian Assassin to battle the Garvins, the Road Warriors, and Steve Williams in a Tower of Doom match at 1988's Great American Bash. The feud finally ended in September when Sullivan crushed Jimmy Garvin's leg with a cinder block. Sullivan and Rotunda continued harassing Steiner as the dog-faced gremlin began turning babyface. Steiner finally snapped, attacking Rotunda and battling his old teammate. The Varsity Club quickly rebounded, with Sullivan bringing in Steve Williams to take Steiner's place. Later, they recruited Dan Spivey, and the Varsity Club enjoyed their most success. Rotunda, who had dropped the TV title to Steiner, regained it. Although Rotunda lost the belt to Sting, he and Williams captured the Road Warriors NWA World Tag Team Championship with help from crooked referee Teddy Long. Unfortunately, the group began to crumble as Steve Williams left the faction, while Spivey exited to pair with Sid Vicious in the Skyscrapers. Nonetheless, the Varsity Club served its purpose, giving Rick Steiner a boost that helped him get over. This led to further success when Rick's brother Scott joined him, planting the seed that led to the Steiner brothers' dominance in the tag team division. The Varsity Club resurfaced in WCW a decade later. Williams and Rotunda launched Varsity Club 2000 in All Japan Pro Wrestling, winning the world's strongest tag team determination league tournament that year. So what were your favorite 80s wrestling factions? Are there any factions you'd like to see covered in depth? Share your thoughts in the comments section and let us know if there are any videos you'd like Wrestling's Greatest Moments to cover. In the meantime, subscribe to our channel, follow us on X and Instagram, and spread the good news about Wrestling's Greatest Moments, the channel that celebrates the squared circle.